The first time I saw her, she was crouched low near my barn, the last light of day catching in her tangled black hair. She moved like a coyote, careful watching the shadows, yet her hands trembled as they worked at the oat sack. I'd set my coffee down and walked out slow boots, crunching over the frost-hardened dirt. She bolted, but her limp gave her away. I caught her by the shoulder, felt the bones under thin skin. The wind was already sharp that night, pushing dust down the slope, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she looked up, eyes steady despite the bruise along her cheek, and whispered, "Have mercy. I can make you a dad if you forgive me." Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a choice that could change everything in a single moment. My name's Calder Vane. I was born in a small clapboard house along the Verde River, the youngest of 3 boys. My father broke horses for a living, and my mother taught us that a man's word ought to be worth more than his hand on a Bible. Sundays we hitched the wagon into town, sat through the sermon, then shared what little we could with neighbors before heading back to the ranch. We mended what we owned instead of buying new, saved every coin until it could do real work. Even as a boy, I could tell the difference between our kind of living and the money that moved through the rail yards and saloons, loud, fast, and never still. I rode as a scout during the war, long miles through country that could kill a man twice before sundown. I learned to read sign in the dust, to keep moving when the sky went black with storm. When the fighting ended, I came back to a place that felt smaller, quieter, and to a woman I'd promised to marry. Fever took her before winter broke, and after that, I kept mostly to my cattle and my fences. The land didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. For years I worked alone, patching wire, riding the line, keeping a watch on the weather. Folks in town said I'd grown part of the rim, silent, hard-rooted. Maybe they were right. The ranch was enough for me. Or at least I thought it was, until the evening I found that young woman among my feed sacks, torn moccasin, barely holding to her foot, the cold already taking her strength. There was a hardness in her jaw that didn't match the dirt on her face, a look I'd seen in men who'd lost more than they'd ever speak of. She didn't beg, just offered that strange bargain in a voice that carried both defiance and weariness. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know what had driven her here, limping through the rim country so late in the season. But I knew enough to keep my rifle low and my eyes on hers. I told her to come along, led her toward the barn, where the lantern still burned. The goats stirred as we stepped inside, their breath warm in the chill air. I dropped an old horse blanket on the straw and left her to it, shutting the door only part way. Outside, the sky was turning to ink, the first stars blinking through. I stood on the porch a long time, listening to the stillness, knowing that whatever had brought her to my gate wasn't likely finished with her yet. And sure enough, before long the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, a hint of trouble moving in from the ridge. The wind carried the bite of coming frost as I crossed the yard that morning. The pump handle groaned with each pull, water slow to rise in the cold. I splashed my face, the sting, waking me more than the pale light ever could. The barn stood quiet, but I stepped inside anyway. Goats shifted in their pen. One of the horses lifted its head. In the back stall, she sat just as I had left, her knees pulled tight to her chest, eyes following me without a word. I asked if she was hungry. She didn't answer. I went back to the cabin, lit the fire, and set a skillet over the flame. A couple of eggs, a scrap of salt pork, yesterday's biscuits softened with grease, simple enough to fill her belly. I brought the plate to the barn, crouched to set it on the straw between us, and straightened without speaking. As I turned to leave, I asked her name. "Asha," she said, her voice low. By the time I'd reached the porch, I heard the scrape of tin as she took the food. The south fence needed attention, so I rode out with hammer and nails. The work was steady, the kind that kept my thoughts from straying too far. By sundown, the light was falling soft over the flats. Back at the barn, I found her sweeping the floor with an old broom oat sack, stacked tools hung in order. She didn't glance my way, just kept sweeping. I told her most who passed through took what they could and kept moving. She stopped, said she hadn't taken anything. I believed her. She asked if I meant to send her away. I didn't have an answer yet. I asked what she meant the night before, offering to make me a father. Her gaze dropped, and she told me about the man who had hurt her and the child she lost before its first breath. Her people blamed her, called her cursed, and cast her out. She said the words to me that night so I wouldn't shoot, not for shame but survival. I went to the back wall, took down a wool blanket, and handed it to her. "Cold tonight," I said. She took it without another word. By the third day she was outside early, sleeves rolled back, working a tangle of wire loose from the goat pen. Her limp was less pronounced now. She tied her torn dress at the waist, with twine the braid in her hair neat again. I asked if she was trying to take my job. She said I moved too slow. I couldn't help the short sound that escaped me close enough to a laugh. We fixed the wire together, her hands steady on the hammer. She said she was from the Sierra Ana band, and I nodded, remembering the beadwork style I'd seen in her dress. Clouds were gathering toward the rim, and she said a storm was coming. She was right. By midday the wind had picked up, and the air smelled of rain. She worked without being told, hauling buckets from the spring, feeding the goats, sweeping the lean-to. I split wood and checked the tack, and we left the rest unsaid. At dusk I brought an old wooden cot into the barn, set it in the corner where the straw had been flattened. I laid a blanket across it. "No more sleeping in hay," I said. She blinked, then murmured her thanks. That night the wind hit the roof hard, rattling boards. I sat at the cabin table, sketchbook open, charcoal tracing lines of an old face from memory. A knock came soft, unexpected. No one ever knocked here. Asha stood in the doorway, wrapped in the wool blanket, hair loose. Her eyes flicked toward the fire. I stepped aside and she crossed the floor, standing in front of the hearth for a long moment. She reminded me I'd said I wouldn't touch her. I told her I meant it. She asked if she could sleep here tonight. I nodded, and she lay near the fire, back to me. I didn't ask why she'd come, but the sound of the wind outside made her choice plain enough. The storm lasted 2 nights. Rain fell in sheets, water pooling against the barn. She kept busy feeding animals, scraping water away from the foundation, sweeping mud from the steps. On the 3rd morning, mist clung low over the brush, the sky pale and bruised at the edges. She crouched at the hearth, stirring cornmeal porridge. She said she used to cook for her mother and brother. I asked if she had family left. No, she said, and nothing more. Later I handed her my old slicker, the sleeves long and the shoulders broad on her frame. We walked the horses to drier ground, checked a gelding's hoof for stones. She learned quick, didn't flinch at the work. Splitting kindling behind the cabin, she swung the axe clean through a log on the first try. A sudden bird call made her duck hand up to her face, body tight as a bowstring. When she straightened, she brushed it off, but her eyes stayed distant. That evening she sat near the fire while I sketched. She leaned in to see the page, a woman's face half finished. I told her it was my wife gone before I came back from the war. She looked at the flames and said her people had buried her too, when they cast her out, never letting her speak. I told her she wasn't cursed. Her fingers touched my hand lightly, and I didn't pull away. Later in the dark, she thanked me for not being like the others. I said nothing, but the silence between us had changed. The frost came harder in the mornings, water freezing in the trough before noon. She began wearing one of my old flannel shirts over her dress sleeves, pinned at the elbows. We stacked dry wood in the lean-to, our hands brushing once in the transfer of cedar splits. She didn't flinch, and neither did I. I cleaned a rifle on the porch and asked if she'd ever fired one. She said her brother taught her. I handed her a shorter Winchester, and her stance told me she knew the truth of it. I told her I'd show her the rim trail if she meant to stay. She said she wanted to if it was allowed. I told her it was. That night she sat close by the hearth, hair drying from a wash in the rain barrel. She wore only the flannel shirt, her dress hanging over a chair. I poured her coffee, our fingers touching on purpose this time. She asked if I had ever thought about having a child. I said years ago with my wife, but we never had the chance. She told me she wanted to give that to someone, to me, if I'd take it. I cupped her cheek, and she leaned into my hand. When I kissed her, she returned it slow, steady. She asked me not to send her back. I told her she wasn't going anywhere. That night she stayed in my bed, her hand held in mine. For the first time in years, I slept with another's breath in the dark, and it didn't feel like an intrusion. Outside the wind eased, but I knew the world beyond my fence still held its dangers, and before long one of them would find its way to my gate. Snow came in thin sheets one night, just enough to turn the ridges pale and make the ground crunch underfoot. The cabin stayed warm from the fire we'd fed through the dark, and I woke to the slow creak of wood settling in the heat. Asha lay beside me, her hair loose across the pillow, breathing even and steady. For a long moment I didn't move. When she opened her eyes, she didn't flinch or pull away, just gave me a quiet morning before pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. We settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. She kept her things in the cabin, now used my comb without asking, and laid her dress by the fire in the mornings, before stepping into it warm. We spoke about the day's chores over coffee, her hands wrapped around the tin cup, steam rising into the cold air that drifted through the gaps in the window frame. Outside the yard was still save for the faint snort of a horse and the distant creak of a frozen fence rail. That afternoon, I took her out along the rim trail as promised. Snow broke beneath our boots, the wind sharp on the high ground. I carried both rifles, handing her one once we were past sight of the cabin. I pointed out the old creek line eastward, the stand of trees where wood stayed dry under thick boughs, and a cave tucked in the stone where I kept spare stores. She listened without interrupting, her eyes scanning the land like she meant to remember every detail. When she said I was showing her how to live alone, I told her it was in case something happened to me. She didn't answer to that. By the time we returned, the sun was dropping low. At the door, she caught my hand and said I didn't owe her anything. I told her I knew. She met my eyes steady and said she wanted to be mine, if I'd have her. I cupped her face in both hands, my thumbs resting at her cheekbones, and kissed her slow. Inside, the fire's glow stretched across the floorboards, and the quiet between us was different now, more certain. The days after stayed cold but clear. She worked beside me, mending a fence line, her fingers quick on the wire. In the evenings, she stitched near the hearth while I sharpened tools. When she laughed once at something small, a goat pushing its head into an empty feed sack, the sound caught me off guard. It had been too long since either of us had heard that kind of ease. Late one morning, movement along the ridge drew my eye. One rider, no dust, coming steady. I stepped onto the porch with my rifle and told Asha to stay close. The man pulled up short of the gate, dismounted, and raised a hand. He said his name was Ryland, a trapper who'd worked this country before the war. His eyes shifted past me toward the cabin, catching sight of her. He asked if she was mine. I told him she was her own. He said there'd been word near Anchor Ridge of an Apache woman cursed by her own people seen wandering near Red Bluff. He thought someone might want her back. I told him plain she wasn't going anywhere. The silence hung before he nodded, climbed back into the saddle, and rode out without looking back. We watched until the shape of horse and rider vanished behind rock. Asha let out a slow breath. She said they were still watching. I told her it didn't matter to me. Her gaze stayed on the empty ridge, and then she told me the rest, that the man who hurt her wasn't of her people, but a white trader who came under pretense of barter. She said she fought him, marked his face, And when the child didn't live, her own tribe turned against her. They told her to keep silent, but she hadn't. The cost was exile. I set the rifle aside and stepped toward her, resting my hand against her cheek. I told her she wasn't cursed. A tear slid down without her moving to wipe it away. That night she sat beside me on the bed, my coat draped over her shoulders. I opened my sketchbook, not to draw the past, but her profile lit by firelight, hair, loose mouth just parted as she watched the flames. She caught me in the act, asked if I'd hang it on the wall. I said I would if she let me. She asked if I feared they'd come back. I told her I'd seen worse. She asked if we'd make it. I looked at her, the same woman I'd found by the feed sacks, bruised and near starved, and told her we already were. We lay down without more talk, her hand in mine under the blanket. Snow began again outside, soft against the roof, and the cabin felt more like home than it had in years. The snow stayed on the ground for a week, lying quiet over the flats and along the fence rails. We moved slower in the cold, taking time to keep the woodpile high and the animals fed. Inside, the cabin had become ours in small ways, a folded blanket over the chair, 2 cups set out by habit, her necklace resting on the shelf above the basin. In the evenings, she sat by the fire brushing her hair in long strokes, while I worked at the saddle leather or my sketchbook. One afternoon, while I was clearing snow from the roof with the long-handled rake, I saw her standing by the porch steps with a bundle wrapped in cloth. When I climbed down, she unwrapped it to show a flat loaf of bread still warm. "I tried," she said simply. I broke off a piece, rough but good, and told her she had remembered how. She smiled at that, faint but sure, before taking the cloth back inside. That night, I brought out a bottle of apple brandy I'd kept untouched for years. We sat by the fire, the light catching in the glass, the air warm from both heat and drink. After the second cup, she laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard from her yet. She said she never thought she'd laugh again. I told her the same. Her fingers found mine and stayed there. Then she asked if I'd give her my name if she gave me a child. I told her she already had it. When she asked me to say it, I did. "Asha Vane," I said, certain. She kissed me, and the night went from there. The days after were steady and quiet. We worked side by side, built the rocking chair she wanted for the porch, and she sewed small clothes from old flannel. I cleared a patch behind the barn for planting corn, though we both knew the real reason. No riders came, no sign of the past creeping in. It was the first time in a long while the land felt like it might let us keep what we had. One afternoon, she returned from the spring with a basket of greens and stopped halfway up the porch steps, a hand pressed to her back. I was on my feet before she could say a word. She smiled and said the child had kicked. She took my hand and placed it low against her belly. It took a moment, but then I felt it, a small, sure nudge. My throat tightened as I looked at her. She only said, "Guess he's real then." I told her so were we. That evening we sat by the hearth, her leaning into me, my hand resting where the child was growing. She asked if I ever thought this would happen. I told her no, and I wouldn't trade a thing that had brought us here. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but in that cabin, the fire burned low and steady, and the quiet between us felt like something built to last. It was in that stillness that I heard it hoofbeat slow, but coming closer over the crusted snow. I set my cup down and stood, the old habit of reaching for the rifle returning without thought. Asha stayed seated, watching me as I stepped to the window. The shape was just a shadow at first, a rider picking his way along the ridge trail. Whoever it was, they were headed straight for us. The rider's outline sharpened as he came down off the ridge, his horse stepping careful on the crusted snow. I stepped out onto the porch, the rifle loose in my hands, but ready. Asha stayed inside, the glow of the fire catching in her hair as she stood by the window. The man reined up short of the gate, lifting a gloved hand before swinging down from the saddle. He wore a long, weathered coat and a hat pulled low, his face lined and wind-burned. He introduced himself as Ryland said he'd trapped north of here since before the war. His voice carried easy, but his eyes were sharp, moving past me toward the cabin. He asked if I'd heard about an Apache woman wandering near Red Bluff, a pretty thing alone. His words were slow, measured, like he was waiting for my reaction. I told him I didn't know anything about Red Bluff. That was when he caught sight of Asha in the shadows behind me. "She yours?" he asked. I told him she was her own. He said folks up near Anchor Ridge claimed she'd brought a curse down on her people, and maybe someone wanted her back. My answer was plain: she wasn't going anywhere. Ryland's gaze lingered, but after a long pause he nodded and said he didn't come for trouble. He climbed back into the saddle, tugged the reins, and rode out without looking over his shoulder. I watched until horse and rider were nothing more than a dark line against the snow. Asha stepped out onto the porch once he was gone, her breath misting in the cold. She said they were still watching. I told her it didn't matter to me. Her eyes stayed on the ridge as she told me the rest of her story. The trader who came under the guise of barter, the way she fought him, the marks she left on his face, and the way her people turned against her when the child didn't live. They told her to keep quiet. She hadn't. That choice cost her her place among them. I set the rifle aside and stepped close, my hand resting against her cheek. I told her she wasn't cursed. Her eyes glistened, though she didn't look away. That night she sat beside me on the bed with my coat draped around her shoulders. I opened my sketchbook not to draw the past, but her profile in firelight hair spilling, loose lips parted slightly as she watched the flames. She caught me in the act and asked if I'd hang it on the wall. I told her I would if she let me. She asked if I feared they'd come back. I said I'd had worse come for me. She asked if I thought we'd make it. I told her we already were. We lay down together without another word, her hand finding mine under the blanket. Snow drifted against the window and the fire settled into a steady glow. The next morning broke clear and cold. Frost rimed the fence rails, and the horse's breath hung like smoke in the air. We worked in silence, mending a gate latch and hauling water from the spring. Asha moved with a steadiness I hadn't seen when she first came. Her eyes stayed sharp on the work, her hands sure. When we returned to the cabin, she busied herself at the hearth, the smell of cornmeal and coffee filling the room. Later that day, I caught sight of her in the yard, one hand resting low on her belly. The gesture was small, almost absent, but her gaze had gone distant, softer. I stepped outside my boots, crunching over the snow, and asked if she was all right. She smiled faintly and told me the child had kicked again. She took my hand and guided it to where the movement had been. We stood like that for a moment, the world quiet around us, except for the creak of the windmill turning slow in the breeze. In the evenings, she sewed by the fire small pieces of flannel taking shape under her fingers. I worked the leather on a saddle, the scrape of the awl and the pop of the fire the only sounds between us. Now and then, our eyes met across the glow, and nothing more needed saying. Outside, the snow was melting back in patches, the ground dark and wet, but winter wasn't gone yet. It was during one of those evenings with the fire low and the wind easing that a second sound reached us, hoofbeats again, this time lighter, faster, carrying more urgency. I set my work aside and stood meeting Asha's eyes before crossing to the door. Whoever it was, they weren't coming at the slow, deliberate pace of a trapper. The second rider appeared out of the trees at a trot, his bay's breath steaming in the cold. Snow still clung to the shaded slopes, but he moved like a man who had been riding hard for miles. I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and waited until he slowed at the gate. He didn't dismount right away, just pushed his hat back and took a moment to catch his breath. He introduced himself as Levi Grant, said he worked out of the trading post 2 valleys over. His coat was dusted with snow boots, wet halfway up from the crossings. He'd heard my name before, knew I kept to myself, and said he wouldn't have come if it weren't important. Asha stepped to the door behind me, her hand resting on the frame. His eyes moved from me to her, and something in his jaw tightened. Levi said he'd been in Bitter Hollow 2 days back when a pair of men came through, asking questions about a young Apache woman her size, the way she walked, the scars on her arm. They carried themselves like they had business, but not the honest kind. One of them had the look of a hand who'd done time. They offered coin for information. Levi didn't give them any, but he figured I ought to know. I asked if they said where they were headed. He said east toward the rim trail, same direction the trapper had come from. They might circle wide or they might ride straight. The wind shifted, then carrying a thin edge of cold from higher ground. Asha's eyes stayed fixed on Levi, though she didn't say a word. I told him I appreciated the warning. He nodded once, turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, I shut the door and set the rifle back in its place. Asha stayed near the window, watching the trail until it disappeared in the trees. I asked if she recognized the description. She shook her head, but said it didn't matter. Word had traveled farther than she thought it would. We both knew what that meant. I told her we'd keep to the routines, but stay ready. She agreed without question. The next days we worked as usual, splitting wood feeding stock, hauling water from the spring. But I kept the rifles closer and my eyes on the ridges more often. Asha moved with the same quiet efficiency she always had. But now she paused more at the sound of a bird call or the creak of a branch. At night she stayed near the fire, sewing until her eyes grew heavy, then curling close beside me under the quilt. One morning a dusting of snow lay over the yard, soft enough to take prints. I saw 2 sets by the corral boots, not hooves. Whoever it was had kept their distance, standing long enough to leave a mark before moving on. I didn't tell Asha until later, after we'd walked the fence line together. When I did, she only said, "They're closer." There was no fear in her voice, but there was no doubt either. We began moving a few supplies to the cave I'd shown her just in case. Dried beans, flour, jerky wrapped in cloth, a lantern with fresh oil. It wasn't much, but it would last a week if it had to. She made the trips without complaint, carrying her share and setting it carefully on the stone shelf inside. Each time she glanced toward the mouth of the cave, like measuring how well it would hide in a storm. That evening, we sat by the fire with the map spread across the table. I traced the trails that wound east and north, pointing out where a rider could approach unseen. She studied it, asked about distances, about how fast someone could travel on foot versus horseback. When she was satisfied, she folded the map and slid it back to me. Before turning in, I stepped outside. The air was still, the stars bright in the clear cold. The snow near the corral had crusted over, but I could still make out where the prints had been. I stood there a long while, listening for anything beyond the quiet, knowing that if they meant to come, they'd choose their moment. Inside, the firelight flickered against the walls, and Asha's shadow moved as she banked the coals for the night. The next morning broke clear, a hard frost silvering the yard. I fed the stove before the sun came up, the smell of coffee mixing with wood smoke. Asha sat at the table, sewing the small shirt in her hands, nearly finished. She moved her needle with steady rhythm, glancing at the window now and again, as though measuring the light. I'd seen that watchfulness before in men on the scout line, eyes on their work ears, tuned to the smallest sound outside. By mid-morning, I saddled the roan and rode the south fence. The snow had melted back to wet ground in spots, leaving tracks sharp in the mud. A deer had come through in the night, but no boot prints. I made a slow loop and came in from the east, the cabin's smoke visible over the last rise. Asha was on the porch when I returned, her braid falling over one shoulder, her hand resting on the rail. She asked if I'd seen anything. I told her not today. That night a thin moon lit the yard, the frost crunching under my boots when I stepped out to check the gate. I'd left a small stick propped against the latch, something easy to fall if disturbed. It was still standing. Inside, Asha had banked the fire and set her sewing aside. She said she'd keep the lamp lit until I came in, a habit we hadn't spoken about, but both understood. 2 days later, we saw movement on the northern ridge. 2 riders, dark shapes against the snow, too far to make out detail. They didn't come down toward the cabin, just stayed along the rise until the trees swallowed them. Asha stood at the window until they were gone, her jaw set. I checked the rifles again that afternoon, made sure the powder was dry, and set extra cartridges in the small box on the shelf by the door. We didn't change our work much, but each chore took on more weight. We moved another load of stores to the cave: jerky, flour, and a can of lard wrapped in cloth. Asha carried hers in a burlap sack over her shoulder, her breath showing in the cold as we made the climb. Inside the cave, the lantern's glow caught the curve of her cheek and the faint rise of her belly. She set the sack down, then stepped to the entrance, looking out toward the line of hills. "They'll come from that way," she said quietly. I didn't disagree. That evening, the wind came up from the west, rattling the loose board on the barn. I fixed it by lantern light, the hammer strikes sounding too loud in the cold air. When I came back in, Asha was standing by the table with the map spread flat. She'd marked the cave, the ridge trails, and the spring in a faint line of charcoal. Her finger rested on a narrow draw between 2 hills. "If they come through here, they'll be on us in an hour," she said. I told her we'd watch it. The following day passed without sight of anyone. Toward dusk, I was stacking wood in the lean-to when Asha called from the porch. I came around the corner to see her pointing west. A single rider was coming in at a slow walk, the light behind him turning his figure to shadow. He reached the gate and stopped. From the porch, I could see his coat was long and dusted white at the hem, his hat low. His left hand stayed on the saddle horn, the other hanging loose. I stepped down into the yard, rifle in hand but lowered. "Evening," he called, his voice carrying across the cold. "Evening," I answered. He asked if this was Vane's place. I told him it was. He said he'd come with a message but could deliver it inside where it was warmer. I didn't move from where I stood. "Say it from there," I told him. He smiled faintly and said, "They'll be here by first light." Then he turned his horse without waiting for reply and rode back the way he'd come. Asha stood beside me, her hand slipping into mine. We both watched until he vanished into the trees. The yard was quiet except for the wind. Inside, the fire still burned, but the air felt different now, more taut, like the hours ahead were already leaning toward what was coming. The hours before dawn were the longest. The fire burned low, the lamplight casting soft shadows on the log walls. Asha rested in the chair by the hearth, the rifle across her knees. I sat near the window watching the ridge. When the first gray light touched the hills, movement came, a line of riders winding down the draw. Their coats were dark breath clouding in the cold. I counted 6. They kept a slow, measured pace, stopping at the edge of the yard. I stepped outside, the frost crunching under my boots. "You're not welcome here," I called. Their leader, a tall man with a scar down his jaw, said they'd come for Asha. His voice carried no hurry, just the kind of certainty that made a man dangerous. Before I could answer, Levi rode up from the south trail, his horse blowing steam. He pulled in hard, placing himself between me and the strangers. "This land's under the protection of the county," he said, holding a folded paper high. "Signed by the circuit judge." The man with the scar glanced at his companions, then back at Levi. "Paper won't stop what's coming," he muttered. But he didn't move forward. One by one, they turned their horses and rode off, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the trees. Levi handed me the paper. It was more than just protection. It named Asha as my lawful wife, securing her place here. He said the judge had signed it after hearing the full account. I looked toward the porch where Asha stood, her eyes steady on mine. We spent the rest of the day in quiet work. The tension had gone, replaced by a stillness that felt new. That evening, I sat on the porch with Asha as the sun dropped behind the ridge. She spoke softly, saying the land felt like it could be home now. I thought about the riders, about the way they'd turned back. Some threats vanish when faced head-on, others linger in shadow. But for the first time in a long while, the path ahead felt clear. Life on the frontier doesn't hand out easy days. The wind will bite the ground, will freeze, and there'll always be someone looking to take what isn't theirs. But sometimes you find people who'll stand with you when it counts. That's what makes a place worth holding. And maybe that's the heart of it. Home isn't just where you hang your hat. It's where you choose to stay and who you choose to stay for. If this story's found a place with you, maybe pass it on or think about the folks who've stood for you when it mattered most. Those are the ones worth keeping close.